What is going on, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Liberty Cast. Thanks for checking us out. This week, we're talking about the confirmation hearings of Judge Amy Coney Barrett and how she pretty much embarrassed all the leftists who tried to question her. We'll get into her answers about the Second Amendment and abortion. And then we'll be talking about, we'll get into the bombshell revelations about Hunter and Joe Biden. Not the bombshells that they kept trying to feed us about President Trump that turned out to be fake every time, but actual bombshells. And of course, we'll get into some Second Amendment news as well. We'll get into all of that and a whole lot more right after this. Thanks for checking us out, folks. If you're watching on YouTube, please head over to rumble.com and search for the Liberty Cast and check us out over there. And be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We're moving away from YouTube. We're tired of the tech tyrants censoring us, and we'll get into that later as well. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, I usually leave the Joe Biden gaffes for the end, despite all of the lids placed on the campaign at 8 or 9 in the morning. He managed to drop some bombs in his town hall the other day. Now, for purposes of this conversation, he was asked about the 1994 crime bill and where he stood today, and he rambled on for about 5 or 6 minutes, and then he meandered into this statement.
There's a lot of things we've learned. And it takes time, but we can do this. You can ban chokeholds, but beyond that, you have to teach people how to de-escalate circumstances. De-escalate. So instead of anybody coming at you and the first thing you do is shoot to kill, you shoot them in the leg.
Oh, good God. We've talked about this before. When a cop in that situation, or anyone in that situation for that matter, is in a situation where they have to draw and possibly fire their weapon. Adrenaline's pumping, the attacker is likely running towards you with a weapon. Perhaps you've already been in a hand-to-hand situation with this person. It is exceedingly difficult to get a hit on center mass in that type of situation. And now he wants to train cops to hit a smaller, moving target? Chuck Remsburg, in an article for the Force Science Institute, interviewed Dr. Bill Lewinsky, executive director of the Force Science Research Center at Minnesota State University, Mankato. Here's just a bit of what he says in this article. Now, this article is about 15 years old, but nothing has changed since he said this. Quote, "Hands and arms can be the fastest moving body parts. For example, an average suspect can move his hand and forearm across his body to a 90-degree angle in 12/100ths of a second. He can move his hand from his hip to his shoulder height in 18/1800ths of a second. The average officer pulling the trigger as fast as he can on a Glock, one of the fastest cycling semi-automatics, requires a quarter-second discharge for each round. There's no way an officer can react, track, shoot, and reliably hit a threatening suspect's forearm or weapon in a suspect's hand in the time spans involved." I mean, it seems like common sense, doesn't it? Now, there are two other points to consider. First, if you do happen to shoot the assailant in an extremity or just graze them or perhaps miss, they can return fire or continue the attack. Not to mention the fact that arms and legs have major arteries that if hit, the suspect could bleed out in a matter of seconds. So shooting to wound could result in the death of either the officer or the suspect. And this just further illustrates that Biden doesn't know what he's talking about. But we all knew that based on this from back in the day.
If you want to protect yourself, get a double-barrel shotgun, have the shells, a 12-gauge shotgun, And I promise you, as I told my wife, we live in an area that's wooded and somewhat secluded. I said, Jill, if there's ever a problem, just walk out on the balcony here or walk out, put that double-barrel shotgun and fire 2 blasts outside the house. I promise you, who's ever coming in is not going to, you don't need an AR-15. It's harder to aim, it's harder to use, and in fact, you don't need 30 rounds to protect yourself. Buy a shotgun. Buy a shotgun.
Not only is that just some of the worst advice ever, but it's illegal in Delaware and lots of other places. So if anyone in Delaware followed that advice, like his wife Jill, who he said he was talking to, they'd be charged with felony reckless endangering and aggravated menacing. Now, we have another update on the Kyle Rittenhouse situation. Now, as a refresher, take a look at this. Now, for our audio-only listeners, that was the video of Kyle being chased just before he shot those 3 people. But something that always bothered me is that there's a shot heard a few seconds before Kyle Rittenhouse shoots. And it turns out they have arrested that person who fired that shot. Now, anyone who watched the video with an open mind or has any experience with firearms or self-defense training and tactics knows that Kyle Rittenhouse was acting in self-defense. Between being chased and hearing that shot, he was legitimately in fear for his life. Now that they have the person who fired that shot in custody, his lawyers are undoubtedly going to argue that the shot, which apparently was fired from a position behind Rittenhouse, is further proof that he was in fear for his life. Again, the tape itself is proof, and, because he was being chased and all, but these people are trying to make an example of him, but it seems they may have picked the wrong case for that. In another update in a case of seemingly malicious prosecution, the McCloskeys pled not guilty to unlawful use of a weapon and evidence tampering. The indictments allege that the gun was rendered inoperable after the incident and before the gun was turned over to police as an attempt to avoid prosecution. Gardner offered no evidence to support that claim, though. Their attorney, Joel Schwartz, pointed out that the only entity that can be proven to have tampered with the evidence is the state through the circuit attorney's office. The Supreme Court relisted an important case called Rodriguez versus the City of San Jose. Now, relisting a case means that they will reconsider taking up the case in the next term. This case has implications with respect to red flag laws because a SCOTUS ruling will impact the government's ability to enter your home and seize your property. But what happened in this case is that the government was placing a man on a mental health hold, and while doing so, entered his home and seized the firearms present in the home, firearms, ammunition, and related property. They did this even though his wife was insisting that she wanted to keep this property while her husband was in custody. After he was released, they petitioned the city to have them return their property. But as you can imagine, in the People's Republic of California, they didn't return it. I actually talked about this case earlier this year when I talked about the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruling that Lori Rodriguez had no right to keep her firearms, but there was nothing illegal about her going to buy another one. The court's position was that because police believed that her husband, who Rodriguez said did not have access to the firearms, but the police believed her husband could pose a threat to public safety, the firearms that had been seized from their home when he was taken into custody on a mental health hold did not have to be returned. Now, under the Ninth Circuit's decision, you may have the right to own a firearm, but the police have the power to seize them and refuse to return them. And as long as you can buy another one, your Second Amendment rights have not been violated. More incoherence from the left. And that incoherence was on full display during the confirmation hearings of Judge Amy Coney Barrett. Judge Barrett survived. No, she didn't survive. She did more than that. She crushed her confirmation hearings. They pressed her hard. They pressed her as hard as they were capable of pressing her, but she swatted those intellectual lightweights away like so many flies. There were quite a few moments that I would love to show you and go over, but we just don't have the time for them all. It could take several shows, but we're going to concentrate on a few that had to do with the Second Amendment, like this one.
I'm going to take you back in history for a moment and note that when that Second Amendment was written, and you did the analysis of it, we were talking about the likelihood that a person could purchase a muzzle-loading musket. We are now talking about virtual military weapons that can kill hundreds of innocent people. It is a much different circumstance. Maybe an originalist pins all their thinking to that musket, but I've got to bring it to the 21st century. In the city of Chicago, more than 3,200 people have been shot just this year. According to the city's gun trace report in 2017, the majority of illegally used or possessed firearms recovered in Chicago are traced back to states with less regulation over firearms. The 2017 report found that Indiana alone was the source of 21% of all Chicago's recovered crime guns. Gun shows are held in Gary, Indiana, and other places, and when they're selling these firearms without background checks, unfortunately, these gangbangers and thugs fill up the trunks of their cars with firearms and head into the city of Chicago and kill everyone from infants to older people. If you eliminate felonies and just confine it to violent felonies, you're opening up more opportunities for people to buy firearms, are you not?
Well, Senator, you referred to gang members and thugs buying guns in Indiana and taking them across the border. And certainly that if they had felony convictions for doing the kinds of things that members of gangs and thugs do, nothing in Cantor says that the government can't deprive them of firearms. And nothing says, in my opinion, that the government can't deprive Ricky Cantor of having firearms. They simply had to make a showing of dangerousness before they did so. And nothing in the opinion opines at all on the legality of background checks and gun licensing. Those are all separate issues.
Durbin made himself look like a complete moron in his questioning of Judge Barrett. All the leftists did. Spartacus, Crazy Maisie, Amy Klobuchar, they all had moments where they came off looking completely ridiculous. Now, she not only thrashed him on the issue of Cantor and how he tried to tie it to the Second Amendment, which was a stretch, but if you're familiar with the stats that he rattled off or have listened to this show, you knew as soon as you heard it that he was lying. He's a Democrat, so if his lips were moving, was probably pretty redundant because if his lips were moving, he was lying. Anyway, he tried to link it to Cantor, which had to do with depriving a nonviolent felon of his or her Second Amendment rights. And as you heard, she brilliantly smacked him down with that. Of course, he then had to get the Second Amendment was written with muskets in mind and whatnot, ridiculousness. We just debunked that last week. I'm not going to get into that again, other than to say that he's dead wrong. And there were more advanced weapons than muskets available then. And the founders knew it, and the founders wanted them. They just couldn't afford them. But she has the left very concerned about the future of their efforts to disarm Americans.
When it comes to your personal views about this topic, do you own a gun?
We do own a gun.
Okay. All right. Do you think you could fairly decide a case even though you own a gun?
Yes,
All right. You're Catholic.
I am.
I think we've established that. The tenets of your faith mean a lot to you personally. Is that correct?
That is true.
You've chosen to raise your family in the Catholic faith. Is that correct?
That's true.
Can you set aside whatever Catholic beliefs you have regarding any issue before you?
I can. I have done that in my time on the Seventh Circuit. If I stay on the Seventh Circuit, I'll continue to do that. If I'm confirmed to the Supreme Court, I will do that still.
They think that because she owns a gun and because she's Catholic, that she can't put those beliefs aside when deciding a case. Once again, they're projecting and accusing someone on the right of doing the very thing of which they're guilty. And they were spewing all kinds of vitriol and nonsense in order to stoke fear into everyone who has a different point of view than they do. But here's a bit of perspective to keep in mind, and I think Judge Barrett said it best when she said this.
So that's the way the process works.
Yes, it would start because there was a law, then there was a lawsuit, then there was an appeal, then the court granted cert, and then the court decided the case.
Is that true no matter what the issue is, whether it's gun, abortion, health care, campaign finance? Does that process hold true for everything?
Yes, you always, judges can't just wake up one day and say, I have an agenda, I like guns, I hate guns, I like abortion, I hate abortion, and walk in like a royal queen and impose, their will on the world. You have to wait for cases and controversies, which is the language of the Constitution, to wind their way through the process.
And that's something that I've said whenever this subject comes up. You just can't, as a Supreme Court justice, decide to rule on a case unilaterally. But they keep putting it out there that, and I think that there are a lot of people who are not familiar with the justice system, the judicial system, and how it works, that they actually believe that her confirmation, once she gets in the court, she could single-handedly overturn Roe or rule assault rifles constitutional. I said assault rifles, not weapons. There's a difference. But I'm going to stick with the hearings for a little bit more, and we're going to pivot to another topic that they talked about, abortion, the right that they just created out of thin air. And as I pointed out earlier and played for you in Judge Barrett's own words, she can't just decide to strike down abortion. It has to go through a process, lawsuits, appeals, circuit court rulings, briefs filed with the Supreme Court, and then there's no guarantee that the court will even take it up. So everyone just needs to calm down. Now, during the hearing, I got into it on social media with someone who posted a meme claiming that being pro-choice is not pro-abortion, and what a woman does with her own body is her choice. Well, yes, it is. You're either okay with killing babies or you're not. And if you're pro-choice, then by definition, you are okay with killing babies and you're pro-abortion. You may not like it, you may not want to accept it, but that's the reality. And so I asked the question, at what point does the baby have their own body? And of course, they dodged that question. They claim that they didn't post it to argue. Okay, so you posted it to virtue signal and get affirmation for your position, but can't defend it. Now, I truly wanted to know because no one has ever been able to answer that question whenever I posed it. And inherent in the argument that what a woman does with her body is her choice, the baby doesn't have a body until it's born. And if you're in New York or Virginia, even then, the baby doesn't have a body worth protecting. And of course, I got the same old song and dance about a woman's choice and her family, blah, 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 whatever. But we already know, based on the clip I played earlier, in the process of getting a case before the Supreme Court, that it's going to take quite a bit before this case, or any case that challenges it, gets heard before the Supreme Court. Senators Feinstein and Klobuchar asked her about her thoughts on Roe versus Wade. And this has been long, but listen to her answers.
Is Roe a super precedent?
How would you define super precedent?
I might thought someday I'd be sitting in that chair. I'm not, I'm up here, so I'm asking you.
Okay, well, people
So-
use super precedent differently.
Okay.
The way that it's used in the scholarship and the way that I was using it in the article that you're reading from was to define cases that are so well settled that no political actors and no people seriously push for their overruling. And I'm answering a lot of questions about Roe, which I think indicates that Roe doesn't fall in that category. And scholars across the spectrum say that doesn't mean that Roe should be overruled, but descriptively it does mean that it's not a case that everyone has accepted and doesn't call for its overruling.
So on something that is really a major cause with major effect on over half of the population of this country, who are women, after all, it's distressing not to get a straight answer. So let me try again. Do you agree with Justice Scalia's view that Roe was wrongly decided?
Senator, I completely understand why you are asking the question, but again, I can't pre-commit or say, yes, I'm going in with some agenda, because I'm not. I don't have any agenda. I have no agenda to try to overrule Casey. I have an agenda to stick to the rule of law and decide cases as they come.
She's thoughtful, she's deliberate, and I think she's going to be a decent addition to the Supreme Court. I'm not as enthusiastic as a lot of conservatives are about how she'll be on the court, because we've been disappointed so many times in the past. So we'll just see what we'll see. And as much as I'd like for it to go away, I'd love to see Roe overturned, but I'm not holding my breath. Roe it's not going anywhere for the foreseeable future. Hunter Biden is now alleged to have engaged in influence peddling, selling access to the government through his father as vice president. A laptop has surfaced with an alleged treasure trove of data and documentation allegedly proving that Hunter Biden has engaged in corrupt activity by selling access to his father and the Obama administration in exchange for that $50,000 to $80,000 a month salary, whichever figure you believe. Now, let me take you back to January. What was going on in January? They were in the throes of impeaching President Trump. And what were they using as the basis for that impeachment? The allegation was that President Trump pressured the president of Ukraine to launch investigations into the energy company Burisma for the sole purpose of hurting his political opponent, Joe Biden. The chief complaint being that the Trump administration had no legitimate basis for wanting an investigation into Burisma. Now, if the information found on this laptop is accurate, and there have been no denials from the Biden camp about it, then the basis for that line of reasoning completely falls apart. And there's a link to the New York Post story up on the website, and I'll have it in the show notes as well. This is an actual bombshell that must be investigated, at least as rigorously as they investigated President Trump for 3.5 years. But the tech overlords at Twitter and Facebook are doing their very best to not have that happen. And we talk about social media and the tech tyrants on this show quite a bit. And Twitter and Facebook took their tyranny to a whole other level last week when they suppressed the story on their platforms. They suspended the Twitter accounts of Kayleigh McEnany, James Woods, Dana Lash, and a few others for tweeting out the story and tweeting out pictures of Hunter Biden in his drug-induced stupor, claiming that it was dangerous. Twitter and Facebook are now, frankly, and have been for a long time engaged in a censorship campaign against conservatives. Facebook and Zuckerberg is still trying to pay lip service to being a neutral platform, but Twitter and Jack Dorsey are on record admitting to their leftist leanings and animosity towards conservatives.
I think it's more and more important to at least clarify what our own bias leans towards, and just express it. I'd rather know what someone biases to rather than try to interpret through their actions. I mean, we have a lot of conservative-leaning folks in the company as well, and to be honest, they don't feel safe to express their opinions at the company, and they do feel silenced.
Of course, that audio and video is very difficult to find now because they don't like the idea of proof being out there that we're right. But the suppression of this story amounts to an in-kind contribution to the Joe Biden campaign. And last I looked, I couldn't find a mention of this story on any of the other 3 newspapers with larger circulations than the New York Post. And Twitter actually suspended the Twitter account of the New York Post, which has the 4th largest circulation of any paper in the United States. And they did this for daring to publish the story. Now, if you tried to post a story on Twitter or Facebook, you couldn't. The tech tyrants were doing everything they possibly could to get Biden reelected. And this is the true election interference. And now, aside from that, aside from the information found on the laptop, some emails have surfaced from a former business associate of Hunter Biden, which seemed to indicate that Biden and his business associates pursued lucrative deals with an entity called the Chinese Entrepreneurs Club, whose leadership includes several senior members of the Chinese Communist Party. The Bidens could be in the pocket of China, getting rich off of our most dangerous geopolitical adversary. This is a national security threat, and I don't see any concern for his vulnerability. And these emails seem legit, and once they're independently authenticated and confirmed that everything in those emails and on this laptop is accurate, the press is still going to stay silent on it. Can you imagine if this was Don Jr. or Eric Trump's laptop or their emails? They would be calling for Trump to resign immediately. And if Trump was implicated in the way that Joe Biden is, I would be inclined to call for his resignation as well. But I'm intellectually honest enough to understand that a substantiated allegation like this constitutes a serious national security threat. Whereas the 3.5 years of investigations that turned up
precisely dick.
So therein lies the difference. One of the left's favorite tactics to manipulate people is to co-opt language. I've been talking about it for a long time. They've been doing it for years. The most recent example occurred during the hearings for Judge Barrett when Mazie Hirono, who is without a doubt the dumbest person in the Senate, and perhaps even throughout both chambers of Congress, with the possible exception of Eric Swalwell, but maybe not. But she said this.
Not once, but twice, you use the term sexual preference to describe those in the LGBTQ community. And let me make clear, sexual preference is an offensive and outdated term. It is used by anti-LGBTQ activists to suggest that sexual orientation is a choice. It is not. Sexual orientation is a key part of a person's identity. That sexual orientation is both a normal expression of human sexuality and immutable.
Seriously? And then Merriam-Webster, unfortunately still recognized as the dictionary of record, even though I stopped using them when they changed their definition of assault weapon to include AR-15s. So I already had no respect for them. But within 24 hours of her saying that, they changed the definition of sexual preference to include the word offensive. Like I said, I already had no respect for them, but this, they let one of the dumbest people in the government dictate how they define words. It's utterly ridiculous. And another one that came up recently is the way they're redefining court packing. Court packing, since FDR tried it, has always meant adding additional judges to the current panel of 9 justices on the Supreme Court. increasing the number of justices on the court is court packing. But now they're trying to say that the constitutional process of nominating someone to fill a vacancy on the court to bring it back to 9 is court packing. But they really want to manipulate the uninformed into thinking that Republicans, by doing their jobs, are engaging in this nefarious activity to pack the court. It's ridiculous. But the assault on our language goes back decades, and I don't know if it started with the word liberal, but it's a classic example of what I'm talking about. The left took the word liberal and adopted it as their label to shield us from their true intentions. And as they introduce more and more leftist policies, they couch it in liberalism, and thereby shifting the Overton window and changing the connotation of the word and changing what's acceptable to people. And if you're not really paying attention, you don't even notice it's happening. And there's some other words that have been redefined and co-opted. Progressive is one, a euphemistic word for socialist and communist. Undocumented, illegal alien, and we already mentioned assault weapon. Reproductive rights, which is abortion, and by definition, the very opposite of reproduction. And those are just a few examples. And now preference is offensive to the LGBTQ community. And this is by Hirono Fiat. Even though leftists have been using the word right up until Crazy Maisie let that word diarrhea spill out of her face.
This time bring everybody along, regardless of color, sexual preference.
Based on whatever color, what their sexual preference might be.
By race, by age, by sexual preference.
It doesn't matter what your sexual preference is.
What their sexual preference is.
Never in the course of her military career had anything about her sexual preference had any impact.
Based upon race, color, or preference or sexual preference.
I don't think that you use the term sexual preference as just, I don't think it was an accident.
Our society has come to respect people, whatever their sexual preference.
And it's not just that. There's evidence among leftist circles that sexual orientation can actually be a preference. An article in Slate, and I want to hat tip Matt Walsh of the Daily Wire for pointing this one out, but there was a 65-year-old man who wrote into Slate about his recent fantasies about being with men. So as usual, Crazy Maisie is just flat wrong. But why is the definition creep of words so insidious? It's because as the meanings of words change over time, and that does happen. That happens as a natural progression of language. But what the left is doing is a deliberate attempt to redefine these words to fit their narrative, as well as apply the current meanings to words to the Constitution, thereby completely distorting its meaning. And we see the left trying to do this with the Second Amendment and the phrase well-regulated militia. And they're doing it now with abortion and sexual preference and a host of others. And as long as we allow the left to continue to manipulate the language like this, words are no longer going to have any meaning. And anyone will be able to decide what words mean at any given time. And people with agendas can misuse words and weaponize language in order to manipulate unsophisticated, uneducated voters. And we can see the fruits of that already starting to pay off. And this is moving way beyond Orwellian into Aldous Huxley Brave New World territory. Because the Presidential Debate Commission couldn't get it together, Biden and President Trump held dueling town halls on different networks. Now, I'm not going to get into a whole lot of this and spend a lot of time on it because it was pretty much a microcosm of how this entire presidency has gone in terms of Trump's relationship with the leftist media. They hate him, and it was obvious that Savannah Guthrie wanted to do everything she possibly could to discredit him. And she gave it an old college try, let me tell you. Almost right out of the gate, immediately, she came with the white supremacy question.
You were asked point blank to denounce white supremacy. In the moment, You didn't. You asked some follow-up questions. Who specifically? A couple of days later, on a different show, you denounced white supremacy. My question to you is,
you've done this to me and everybody.
Why does it seem like
I denounced white supremacy? Okay,
you did
I've
2 days
denounced
later.
white supremacy for years, but you always do it. You always start off with a question. You didn't ask Joe Biden whether or not he denounces Antifa. I watched him on the same basic show with Lester Holt, and he was asking questions like Biden was a child.
So this is a little bit of a dodge.
Are you listening? I denounce white supremacy.
Okay.
What's your next question?
It sounds like a dodge. Okay, you want to hit him for the way he handled it in the debate, fine. Ask the next day, but move on. Especially when there's ample video evidence going back decades of him denouncing white supremacy. But John Roberts at Fox actually got this ball rolling when he had his temper tantrum in front of Kayleigh McEnany, saying that all of that was in the past and he needed to reiterate it now. The debate had just been that previous week, and he's denounced it every time he's been asked since. But Guthrie, for the frillionth time, asked again. So she proved herself to be a partisan hack. Now, if you watched it or saw the highlights like I didn't want to watch it, you saw Savannah Guthrie, who is not an ugly woman, look like a deranged lunatic when she was questioning him, which wasn't really her role. She was there to facilitate the audience asking questions. But she pretty much ended up debating the president herself, and she lost.
Let me ask you about QAnon. It is this theory that Democrats are a satanic pedophile ring and that you are the savior of that. Now, can you just once and for all state that that is completely not true and that disavow QAnon in its entirety?
I know nothing about QAnon.
I just told you.
I know very little. You told me, but what you tell me doesn't necessarily make it fact. I hate to say that. I know nothing about it. I do know they are very much against pedophilia. They fight it very hard, but I know nothing about it.
They believe it is
If
a
you'd like me
satanic
to
cult run by the deep
study the
state.
subject, I'll tell you what I do know about. I know about Antifa, and I know about the radical left, and I know how violent they are and how vicious they are, and I know how they're burning down cities run by Democrats, not run by
Republican
Republicans.
Senator Ben Sass said, quote, QAnon is nuts and real leaders call conspiracy theories conspiracy theories.
He may be
Why not
right.
just say it's
Can I be
crazy and
honest?
not true?
He may be right. I just don't know about QAnon.
You do know.
I don't know. No, I don't know. I don't know.
Let me
tell
ask you
all
another
about
thing.
it. Let's waste a whole show. You start off with white supremacy. I denounce it. You start off with something else. Let's go. Keep asking me these questions.
I do have one more in this vein.
Let me just tell you, what I do hear about it is they are very strongly against pedophilia. And I agree with that. I mean, I do agree with that, and I agree
But
with
there's
it
not
very
a
strongly.
satanic pedophile
I have
cult
no
being run
idea.
by.
I know
You
nothing
don't know
about
that? Okay.
No, I don't know
You
that.
just
and neither,
this
neither
week.
do you know that.
Okay.
Biden, on the other hand, got nothing but softball questions from Stephanopoulos and the audience. There was even a former Obama speechwriter who pretty much echoed all the leftist talking points in his question. Now, we already covered one of the questions from the town hall, but listen to this madness.
I'm the proud mom of 2 girls, 8 and 10. My youngest daughter is transgender. The Trump administration has attacked the rights of transgender people. How will you, as president, ensure that the lives and rights of LGBTQ people are protected?
I will flat out just change the law, eliminate those executive orders, number one. The idea that an 8-year-old child or a 10-year-old child decides, I decided I want to be transgender. That's what I think I'd like to be. It'll make my life a lot easier. There should be zero discrimination.
Do we really need to go over why that was another dumbass answer in a long line of dumbass answers by this guy? Okay, for the cheap seats, or any leftists who might be listening, children change their minds more often than they change their underwear. They don't have the cognitive ability to understand what effects the hormones they'll be taking will have on their physiology. And if they can't consent to sex, They can't consent to having surgery that will permanently disfigure them and alter their physiology. He was clearly pandering to the ultra-woke crowd. These dueling town halls were pretty much a microcosm of the Trump presidency. Actually, pretty much the way he's been treated by the leftist media since he came down the escalator to announce his candidacy. And it showed the difference between how they treat Trump and the way they treat their own. Okay, we're going to get you out of here with a few quick hits. First, Jim Acosta actually agrees with President Trump about something. I wonder how his colleagues at CNN felt about this.
But Iowa and North Carolina are really states that should be in the bag for President Trump right now. That's an indication as to how much trouble he's in politically right now, Wolf. And as this crowd is chanting that there are members of the press here who suck, I should also point out, Wolf, what also sucks, getting the coronavirus.
Jim Acosta is one of the dumbest people in media. The dumbest is probably Brian Stelter, and I know Dan Bongino thinks that Chuck Todd is right there with him, and that's probably true. But Acosta, he is definitely in the running, and this is the funniest illustration of that. Now, despite Acosta's idiocy, CNN seems to have bumped their collective heads and remembered that they're supposed to be a news organization. First, Jake Tapper was talking to a Biden campaign official about the confirmation hearings, and he actually pushed back on their position that what's happening is unconstitutional.
I want to get to the idea of adding justices to the court in a second, but he said it's not constitutional what they're doing. How is it not constitutional what they're doing?
His point is that the people have an opportunity to weigh in on this constitutional process through their vote. And we are now in the midst of the election. Millions of people have already cast their votes. And you see that the vast majority of people say that they want the person who wins the election on November 3rd to nominate the justice.
That's a
take
poll.
this
That's
seat.
not the Constitution.
So there's the constitutional process of advise and consent. The American people get to have their say by voting for president, by voting for senators. We are now 23 days from the election.
Right, but it's not unconstitutional.
Millions of votes. Voters are being denied their constitutional right to have a say in this process.
They
when
elected
the Republicans
the Senate.
are trying to ram through a nominee who, by the way, is going to change the makeup of the court. And we see time and time again, poll after poll shows that most Americans vehemently disagree with this. They believe
Kate, that's
that
a
the
poll.
vote should happen on November 3rd.
That's not what the word constitutional means. Constitutional doesn't mean I like it or I don't like it. It means it's according to the U.S. Constitution. There's nothing unconstitutional about what the U.S. Senate is doing.
And then Wolf Blitzer gets into it with Nancy Pelosi.
Even the members of your own caucus, Madam Speaker, want to accept this deal. $1.8 trillion. Congressman Ro Khanna, for example. But let me just quote Ro Khanna, a man you know well. I assume you admire him. He's a Democrat. And he just said this. He said, people in need can't wait until February. $1.8 trillion is significant and more than twice the Obama stimulus. Make a deal. Put the ball in McConnell court. So what do you say to Ro Khanna?
What I say to you is, I don't know why you're always an apologist, and many of your colleagues apologists for the Republican position. Ro Khanna, that's nice. That isn't what we're going to do, and nobody's waiting till February. I want this very much now, because people need help now. But it's no use giving them a false thing just because the president wants to put a check with his name on it in the mail.
Is she serious? CNN carrying water for the Republicans and Trump? If there was ever any proof that Nancy needs to go, that was it. There's never been a day since he came down that escalator that CNN has had a positive thing to say about President Trump. And to suggest that CNN is somehow carrying water for him is just ridiculous. Sit down, Nancy. You're drunk. Okay, I read this story, and you know that feeling you get when you read or hear something so stupid that you just can't understand how someone could have made their mouths say the words or fingers type such nonsense? Well, brace yourself. Carrie Cruz Bueno, a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University's Annenberg Institute, which should be a clue as to how ridiculous this is going to be, tweeted that Black Airbnb guests may be traumatized by Trump 2020 signs and American flags, and that Airbnb doesn't understand the trauma of Trump signs for a black person. Okay, as a black man, and I know that must come as a shock to some of you, but I've been black for 50 years, and I can say that a Trump sign, or any sign for that matter, has never traumatized me. And the American flag has always been a symbol of freedom and pride. If a Trump sign or the American flag causes you to fear for your life or traumatizes you in some way, that's a you problem. But that's not the only campus craziness going on. The University of Minnesota School of Social Work is offering a special webinar series in which white participants undergo a 12-step plan similar to Alcoholics Anonymous to help them recover and reclaim our full humanity. And the 12-step plan outlined in part one of the series is called Recovery from White Conditioning, Building Anti-Racist Practice and Community. This is white guilt on steroids and racist as hell. You're telling people that they have to atone for an immutable characteristic over which they have no control. It makes absolutely none of this makes any sense, does it? What country is this? And finally, on a slightly more positive note, a 5-year-old boy in South Bend, Indiana, tackled an armed home invader when 4 men, at least 3 of whom were armed, busted into a home when another child answered the door. There's actually video footage of this, and while it's disturbing because it looks like one of the perps slaps the kid continues to fight. That's a future sheepdog right there, and you need to get that kid some MMA training, some jiu-jitsu, boxing, something, and then teach him how to handle weapons. What you can't teach is the kind of heart that 5-year-old kid had. The world needs as many sheepdogs as we can get. So recognize the traits and train them up. Good for you, kiddo. Anyway, folks, that's our show. I will try to do better next time. But thank you all for watching and listening. If you prefer audio only, check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, Spotify, whichever podcast platform you prefer. And please like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. You can find us on thelibertycast.net. Go to the podcast page, and you'll find all the latest podcasts there as well. We're also on the rightway.site. And of course, you can find us on social media, Parler, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, at The Liberty Cast on all 4 platforms. And again, thank you all for taking the time to spend with me, whether you're watching or listening. And until next time, keep your head on a swivel and stay safe, everybody.